Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Jan Eliasson, Chair of the SIPRI Governing Board.
Sounded almost like the Oscars here. Anyway, welcome again to this meeting on societal security here in Stockholm. I hope you had a good night's sleep, those who attended the meeting yesterday, and also that you could struggle through the traffic jams in Stockholm. We are in an internal construction phase here in the city of Stockholm. Very good that we could now continue today. I thought about the session yesterday, which I thought set the stage in a very good way with the introduction by the Minister Wallström and the panel discussion. And I said to myself that this is actually a very modern agenda, that we are getting ready for tomorrow's challenges, which are not only international, but also regional and national and even local. And in the course of the discussions yesterday, I said that the borderline between local, regional, national, and international is slowly disappearing in an interesting way, and that we, in order to find really true security and lasting security, have to work on both levels, or four levels, all four levels at the same time, in fact. And that means that the subjects that we are discussing are the ones that create sort of the backbone of the strength of a society. And if we pursue that road well and establish security in its deepest sense in our own countries, I think that would be not only a contribution to our citizens and those who live in our countries, but in fact also to international peace and security. In my many years at the United Nations, I have found that when you don't have that stability inside a country, you have factors that bring about tensions and in the end very often conflicts. So I think we have a duty, all of us, in different ways to contribute to stability and cooperation in this region. And today we are going into more concreteness and what we mean by this security, the broader security, the security that we have discussed yesterday, I will today. And the broader security then implies areas that we will today pursue, which are extremely important and interesting. We will have a panel in a little while on the climate change adaptation and civil protection. We will then have breakout sessions. It's like an intellectual a la carte menu for you. Breakout sessions in two sections covering such important subjects as nuclear security, resilience against extremism, a healthy Baltic Sea, safe cities, gender-based violence, and looking into the strategy for the Arctic Council, a body of growing importance, as we all know. So all this to just give you a taste of what we are doing today, but I really want to tell all of you that in the areas which you all pursue, you should know that that is one contribution to this broader security that we have to build, where we get closer actually to the health and well-being of our citizens, and that is actually the basis for any security structure and system. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. I'm very happy to welcome to Stockholm Dagfinn Høybråten, whose summary is very long. I will not read it all out for you, showing his great experience both as a civil servant and as a minister and also leader of a party, the very important Christian Democratic Party in Norway. You have served in Parliament for many years, in the Danish Parliament, in the Norwegian Parliament. Now you are based, of course, as Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers in Copenhagen. So we are very glad to welcome you. I particularly am very glad to note your great interest in health. You were Minister of Health, but you also, I know from my colleagues at the United Nations, have been a very strong driving force in the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and personally very committed to this extremely important thing of immunizing millions of children, particularly in the world. And for that, I want, particularly with my UN heart, to thank you very warmly. But Dagfinn, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for those warm words of welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, organizers, thank you for inviting me and give me an opportunity to share my perspective on the issues of societal security challenges in the Baltic Sea region. The perspective seen from the Nordic Council of Ministers, that is. Many metaphors can be used about the Baltic Sea, and has been so, truly. I prefer to look at it as a jewel. We depend on it in many ways. It is a means of transportation, a source of food, it connects us, and it grants us priceless recreational values. The Baltic Sea is indeed something we must treasure and protect. It provides us with a common context, a reference point. However, we're not only neighbors around the same sea. When it comes to societal security, we are in fact in the same boat. In our globalized world, so many of the challenges we deal with know no borders, particularly challenges related to societal security. And on this basis, we must work together to find the solutions we need for the sake of the people living in the region, and especially for the sake of our children. Their future depends on our action today. So let me give you some very concrete examples of how we address this in the realm of official Nordic cooperation between the Nordic governments. Starting with one of the most central challenges of our time, environment and climate, which we will revert to later today. I would argue that the state of the Baltic Sea can be seen as a marker of success or failure of the mutual cooperation and relations between the states around it. If the sea does well, it is because the states around it have a close, trustful cooperation and connection. Furthermore, problems such as those related to the effects of climate change or contamination due to harmful outlets also directly influence the safety of our citizens around the Baltic Sea. Even though the state of the Baltic Sea has improved over the last few decades, there is still much work to be done. In the realm of the Nordic cooperation, we therefore work closely together on environment and climate issues relevant to the Baltic Sea, both on a strategic and a practical level. One concrete example of this is cooperation in connection with oil spills and other shipping accidents with hazardous material in the Nordic waters, including the vulnerable Baltic Sea. For almost 50 years, the Nordic countries have worked together and coordinated immediate rescue actions to minimize the harm to the environment from such accidents. Another area where there has been a close cooperation between the countries around the Baltic Sea lately is in meeting the challenge of climate change. Last year, the Nordic Prime Ministers launched a program called Nordic Solutions to Global Challenges. In light of the UN 2030 agenda, the purpose of this program is to share good Nordic solutions with the rest of the world. In that connection, we work with the Baltic countries to share best practices on energy and climate solutions. Specifically, this cooperation focuses on the potential of scaling up already known sustainable energy solutions and climate solutions. And we have done a concrete analysis together with the Baltics showing that in the Baltic countries, wind power stands out as the solution with the largest potential for emission reductions. In fact, scaling up wind energy would allow Estonia to cut 12% of its emission by 2030, Latvia 14%, and Lithuania 16%. This is a substantial potential. Environmental cooperation across the Baltic Sea is profound. However, environmental challenges are not the only borderless challenges we face. Fighting extremism and promoting inclusion, democracy, and security is another great challenge of our time. Over the past years, we have seen a rise in violent extremism which represents a fundamental threat to our societies, not only because of the immediate physical danger that it poses, but because it challenges our democracies and our very way of life. It challenges the essence of the societies that we have built, and they are built on trust. Trust in our citizens and trust in our social order. A society closing its doors around itself is an excluding society where people become suspicious of each other. It is a society where we ultimately become less tolerant to other people's ideas and convictions. We must do what we can to fight this development in the Nordic and the Nordic-Baltic region. On this background, we have initiated a program called Nordic Safe Cities, which is a network of Nordic cities working actively together to ensure trustful, tolerant, and resilient cities development that can prevent radicalization and violent extremism. In the Nordic region, we pride ourselves with values like freedom and trust, an immense shared sense of community. But these are values shared also by other countries, by Nordic and Baltic countries, and they're truly worth protecting. But these values are not only possible to uphold as long as we live in safe societies where we do not have to fear for our fellow citizens. The Nordic Safe Cities Network is helping cities to create trust and tackle fears. The network is focusing on preventive work and has initiated gatherings, arenas, activities on issues like right-wing extremism, safe and sustainable cities, violence and crime in the youth communities and families and schools as preventive arenas. This is a valuable cooperation which helps spread good practices and experiences. The same can be said about our program on counter-trafficking. Unfortunately, not all people who cross the Baltic Sea do so of their own free will. Far too many do so because they are victims of trafficking. Trafficking in human beings, a modern way of slavery, is a crime that crosses borders, and this makes regional cooperation an important element of counter-trafficking work. The Nordic Council of Ministers has, in cooperation with partners in the Baltic Sea region, national authorities, NGOs, and other international organizations, implemented a range of counter-trafficking initiatives since 2001. In close cooperation with partners in the region, we carry out our initiatives aimed at building and strengthening anti-trafficking networks, creating platforms for the exchange of experience and knowledge among those working in the fields on all the different levels, that be in the social sector or in the judicial sector and in other sectors of society. For instance, later this year, we'll organize a conference in Riga where experts from the region will be invited to discuss and share experiences on corporate social responsibility and the work on preventing trafficking for labor exploitation. Our cooperation on counter-trafficking is just one of many successful cooperation projects between the Nordic Council of Ministers and partners around the Baltic Sea. For more than 10 years, the Nordic Council of Ministers has supported cooperation among NGOs from practically all countries around the Baltic Sea. This facility provides for people-to-people networking and focuses on important societal security questions such as trust, equal rights, transparency, good governance, democracy, freedom of speech, inclusion, social security, and, as I already mentioned, environmental protection. These are all elements in the soft department, but societal security is gaining momentum when carried on a wave of exchange of information and views, knowledge, and mutual understanding from people to people. The same rationale is behind the Nordic Council of Ministers' continued support to the Nordic-Russian cooperation. Despite the fact that the political situation is deeply challenged, we carry on the good pragmatic work of cooperation that has been ongoing for more than 20 years. In times of difficulties, the encouraging fact is that there is great interest in cooperation among partners in both the Nordic countries and in northwest Russia. I'm convinced that mutual understanding between the peoples of Russia and the Nordic countries should continue and be strengthened. The opposite would only be counterproductive. One successful example of this cooperation is the Nordic-Russian health program, which I was involved in as a Minister of Health of Norway a few years ago. It focuses on diseases with a cross-border impacts, such as HIV and tuberculosis and other. Health security is evidently an important part of the societal security challenges we must address in the Baltic Sea region context. Looking at the Baltic states, we have continued the positive development of our cooperation. Today, one of our important initiatives in that region is the support for Russian language media in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These countries have a substantial Russian-speaking population, and there is a relatively limited supply of qualitative Russian and Polish language media, particularly at the local level. Focus is on supporting the basis for quality media production about local conditions for local people in their own language. The purpose of this is to improve the access to balanced information, which should lead to better opportunities for inclusion of the Russian-speaking people and their participation in the future development of societies. Let me finally turn to an issue which cannot be ignored when debating societal security in our time: digitalization and cyber security. With the rapid technological development, Internet of Things and the widespread use of data in our societies, we become more and more vulnerable towards cyber attacks. Within the last couple of years, we have seen many examples where critical digital infrastructure has been attacked. Besides the economic loss, cybercrime also affects citizens and enterprises' trust in the digital services and the digital economy as such. Therefore, it is of utmost and increased importance that the Nordic and Baltic governments invest in cyber and information security, protecting personal and sensitive data, and maintain a high level of trust in digital services. Since the nature of cybercrime is borderless, the prevention must be handled and coordinated in close cooperation with the international partners. The Nordic countries are closely engaged in regional cooperation and policy development at a Nordic-Baltic level. In 2014, the Nordic and Baltic states adopted a landmark agreement deepening cyber defense cooperation across a range of initiatives to protect industrial and military infrastructure. The Nordic and Baltic governments also approved the development of common cyber defense strategies covering also the industrial infrastructure. I started by calling the Baltic Sea a jewel, which we must treasure and protect. Evidently, this also goes for the regional cooperation around the Baltic Sea. Without regional cooperation, we will not be able to protect the sea the way we should. The sea which connects us and which puts us in the same boat. Without regional cooperation, we will not be able to protect our citizens from any borderless challenges. And without regional cooperation, we will not be able to give our children and grandchildren the future they deserve. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this light, this is the time for more cooperation, not less cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dagfinn, for this comprehensive and still concise presentation of the different challenges of security. Yesterday we used the phrase security starts at home, you may recall, and Bengt Sundelius, who was in the panel, mentioned that yes, security starts at home, but we are not home alone, reminding us of a movie, wasn't it? And that's very interesting that this work that on the surface seems to be national, in fact, always reaches out to the region and neighbors. And I think the question that we should ask ourselves today in all these sessions that we have is how can we further increase this cooperation among us in sectors that we traditionally understand as domestic, but where in today's world they reach out with effects, not least look at Baltic Sea health and so forth and other issues. They reach out in the international sphere. And I think we are now historically in a situation where our institutions in our own countries have to connect also to the outside. And what is then more natural for us than to connect with our neighbors, with those in the Nordic Baltic region? And therefore, I think we should always have this international perspective, bring in the issues of where we can learn from each other, where projects can be done together, where studies can be done together, a number of areas where we could reach out, and by that strengthen the cooperation in this Nordic-Baltic area, and also give a serious contribution to security in its widest sense. And I'm glad also that you, Dagfinn, in particular mentioned the cooperation with Russia. There have been some problems in that relationship in the political area, the hard security area, but I think in this sub-regional regional cooperation, Russia is a very active part. We had an intervention yesterday at the panel from our Russian friend and colleague, but I think it's very important that we use these regional cooperation structures also to strengthen that relationship, which relates then to the wider and broader security sense also into the area of hard security. So with these words, underlining the importance of this meeting and the modernity of this meeting, I now hand over to my dear friend and colleague, the director of SIPRI, Dan Smith, who will be the moderator also for this morning's plenary session. So, yeah, Dan, you have the floor.
So, thank you very much, Jan, and also thank you to Dagfinn Høybråten for another talk setting the framework of the cooperation and the need for cooperation so clearly. And I think that we have set up the sort of the big picture very, very well and very effectively during the two keynote speeches we've heard and the panel yesterday evening. And so with this panel now, we begin to start to dive in to the specific issues and take a somewhat deeper dive. So can I ask you to welcome the panel to the platform? Paolo Albrito, who is Chief of Regional Office for Europe in the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. Cecilia Dore, who's the Director of the Norwegian Directorate for Civil Protection. Andre Joll, Head of Group in the European Environment Agency, and Professor Bjørn-Ole Linnér from Linköping University. And I'm going to start actually with you, Bjørn-Ole, and our focus is on the question of climate change, vulnerability, and adaptation in the face of that. So can you just give us an overview of climate change in the Baltic Sea region? Tell us about it.
Okay. Four issues then. So first, impacts, then I would say a few words on adaptation, mitigation, and then removal, which I think is a common issue. So when it comes to the impacts, we know that some of the really hard problems that we face is the eutrophication of the Baltic, which will increase with a warmer climate. We have increased droughts. We have experienced a glimpse of it this past month in large parts of the Baltic countries. And then connected to that is, of course, that we will see increased water, decreased water quality. It's already a problem. We have desalination strategies and also operations going on in Sweden, for instance, in the islands of Gotland and Öland and other parts of the Baltic where we already start to work with desalination of the seawater from the Baltic to prepare us for water shortage. And that has in itself health and environmental problems. More importantly, perhaps when it comes to the impacts, though, we can know quite a lot about the direct impacts of climate change. But the indirect impacts of climate change, that's why we know little. And I think that's one of the reasons in the Baltic countries, we consider ourselves relatively not so vulnerable to climate change. 45% or something like that of the cities around the Baltic consider themselves at risk for climate change compared to 77% globally. So we have a sense that we are rather secure, relatively speaking. But if we would look at the indirect impacts, where our trade, our financial flows, migration flows, and so on, can be impacted by climate change, direct impacts in Africa, in Asia, and so on as well. That could hurt our industries quite severely and disrupt our economies in a way that we haven't planned for, and we have little knowledge. So that is something that we, I think, should put a lot more interest in. We have a research program where CIPRI is a prominent part, Mr. Geopolitics, where we look at these transboundary impact pathways. We need to know more about that. When it comes to mitigation, that's up to each country. After the Paris Agreement, we have the nationally determined contribution, should be up to each country. But of course, our mitigation strategies are very much entwined with energy security, which creates a problem. We know when Finland builds a nuclear reactor, that is, the argument is climate arguments, but also the deep dependency on energy from Russia, as one example. When Estonia is pressured to lower their emissions, Estonia has one of the highest carbon intensity in Europe, and that is because of the oil shale extraction, which is a large part of Estonia's economy. But to put pressure on decreasing that, of course, would mean larger energy insecurity. So that's a problem. Okay, finally then, removal. We will see an increased focus and an increased discussion on removal technology, carbon dioxide removal technologies in the Baltic countries, where you, for instance, use bioenergy, produce bioenergy and directly capture it and store it, like with the carbon capture and storage technologies. It's technologically feasible, even though some development is needed, but it's economically and socially legitimacy reasons not that it's not up and running yet. And maybe we won't see it, but there will for sure be a lot of more interest. Norway and Sweden are very well positioned, for instance, to use this technology. So we will see a lot of more of that in the discussion.
You raised the question of the social legitimacy of carbon removal technologies. And that immediately connects to, in my view, to our broader topic here of societal security. So how do the climate change challenges and responses fit into that bigger concept of societal security which we're addressing?
Yeah, so we often say that climate change is a risk multiplier. So in added to other risks where you have social instability or economic inequality and so on, climate change is there as a risk multiplier. That is true when it comes to the impacts of climate change, but it's also true when it comes to the impacts of climate policies, which can have quite some impact on society, both positively but it can also increase tensions.
I was going to say there's surely two sides of the coin. If you get it wrong, you may get it wrong in ways that knock on, as you said, through indirect consequences. But if you get it right, there could be a lot of positive spillover.
Yeah. And if we take, connected to the theme here, if we take adaptation, that is one of the positive areas for where we have dialogue around the Baltic, for instance. And we know Putin has said that that's the primary, most important policy area for climate is the adaptation strategies.
So Cecilia Dorr, if I come to you, I mean, Norway obviously has its national efforts to respond to climate change. How do those link or not link to Baltic and Nordic cooperation frameworks?
If I should start at some point, I think that almost any work we do in civil protection and preparedness, we are acknowledging risks that doesn't acknowledge any borders at all. Right. And that means that it needs a holistic, comprehensive, all hazards, or at least the most hazards approach. And that's really important to understand, because civil protection is actually working with a system approach. And even though I should not do this too academic, I think it's important to say that also in this field, and then I take the broad perspective on civil protection, what works is prevention, prevention, prevention. just like the former health minister in Norway wisely know. But we have to have all the other elements in place also. Of course, response. We need to learn from what we cooperate on and experience, and we have to acknowledge that we are in a position where we lack a lot of knowledge, actually. Also in the academic field, we need more research. But in Norway, of course, we are very exposed at the time to any hazards, actually, and also climate change. And as you all know, we have lots of storm surges, floods. Every day now, I pray for rain. And I think the Swedes do as well. We cooperate a lot. So a lot of things is going on. And we see that we need to cooperate on a cross-border level, and the Baltic region and the Nordic region are very important to the Norwegians as well, and we do a lot of work here.
So you started by saying virtually anything in civil protection, you're cooperating. So picking up on the point where Bjørn Ola was ending, what are the synergies that you find between adapting to climate change and the broader agenda of civil protection?
If you take the position I do with the all hazards approach, we are working on building stepwise resilience in all our systems so they can actually handle any event that might happen. So in my perspective, we don't climate change, terrorism, diseases like Ebola crisis we have at the moment, technology vulnerabilities, any of these themes, they will actually need the same strong, resilient system which can manage the consequences. And that's why any work we do in any field will actually contribute to the resilience building.
So in one way, what you're saying, I mean, if I just try to simplify for my own simple mind, basically resilience is resilience.
Yeah. Basically. And then there are specialized parts of this, of course. But on handling the consequences, it's like that. And that's actually civil protection and preparedness.
It's a little bit like a metaphor of health as well. I mean, a healthy person is a healthy person with a stronger immune system and probably runs less risk of certain diseases and epidemics than somebody who has had a record of ill health. So health is health and resilience is resilience. It's actually quite an optimistic message.
In a way, yeah, I think so. And I think also to acknowledge the risks and behave sensible and invest in building resilience actually is the same perspective as in health. It's a good metaphor, I think. Yeah.
So, Andre, if I can move to you, and again ask you to take a broad view. I mean, I asked Bjørn Ola a tough enough question, so, you know, Baltic Sea region and climate change, what about it? How about I just raise the stakes a bit? Europe and climate change, what about it?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this conference. So we are actually an agency of the EU providing information and knowledge to the European Parliament, the European Council and the European Commission. A lot of these climate change impacts, risks and vulnerabilities are of course common across Europe. It's not easy to say which parts of Europe are more vulnerable. They all have their own types of risks. You're very well aware of the Mediterranean with large increases in heat waves, droughts, risk for the population because of heat waves, but also for agriculture, for example, because of droughts. But I'd like to maybe highlight a few things which are specific for this region. I think the Arctic, it has been mentioned many times, is a very crucial let's say ecosystem, but also for many other reasons it's crucial. So there may be opportunities for, let's say, transport, but also for oil and gas exploration in future. However, I think it's very important to look at the environmental consequences of these potential future opportunities, and maybe even ask the question, are these opportunities actually in line with the global Paris Agreement, which still aims, of course, to keep the temperature far below 2 degrees increase. Maybe also to mention, as you said, actually healthy, well, if people are healthy, they are more resilient. I think it's also valid for ecosystems. If you have, let's say, healthy ecosystems, they are more resilient for shocks. I think in this part of the world, it's interesting to look at forests. If you plant trees, you have to think far ahead. So what type of forest is there in the future, which is actually suitable for the changing climate? Maybe a couple of things to add on human health, which are also very specific. A topic like increases in ticks. People go, of course, more into the forest, but it's also induced by climate change being a multiplier, as was mentioned earlier. Issues of particular infections like Vibrio has been actually found in the Baltic Sea already. It's not been found before, so will there be increases in these types of new diseases? What is also important, I think, is to recognize there is an EU action on climate change adaptation. It's the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy of 2013. The EU is currently evaluating this. The evaluation will be finished by the end of this year. It's going to be really interesting to see what will be the outcome of that. But what can already be said is there are some emerging topics. One was mentioned already, is what is the, let's say, the effects of climate change outside Europe on Europe? How do we deal with this in future? I think another interesting topic is what is socially just adaptation. I don't think it has been covered very much yet. A third point maybe to make is nature-based solutions. This is really emerging as a key solution. It's not a solution to all climate change problems, but it's really an interesting one. Renaturalization of rivers, giving rivers more room, green-blue cities, having more parks, green roofs in cities, for example. And the third point to make is financing. It's very interesting to see there is now quite a focus on financing. The EU has come up, or the Commission, I should say, has come up with a proposal for sustainable financing, very much focused actually on mitigation to climate change, but also adaptation is covered there. So hopefully that will help to find financing sources, because it is actually difficult to find financing for adaptation.
So I just want to pick out one thing that you were saying in there, again, because it connects so well to our broader agenda. You mentioned socially just adaptation. Mm-hmm. So offer some examples of socially unjust adaptation and see where that takes us.
Yeah, well, it's actually not something covered very much yet, but one thing is that some parts of the population are more exposed and have more, let's say, inherent vulnerabilities due to their circumstances. So for example, people with low incomes, they tend to be in parts of the city which are potentially having more air pollution and also potentially having more risk because of heat waves in those parts of the city. So then the types of adaptation, what to think about is involving communities more and making sure that also those people which are having, for example, low incomes and are, let's say, more deprived, benefit from those types of adaptation solutions.
Paolo, if I can come to you now. Again, we're sort of broadening the perspective more to the UN level and to the Sendai framework. But link that for us to the Baltic Sea region, if you can. What's the first of all, maybe a quick outline of what the Sendai framework is, and then how does that have practical implications or effects for the Baltic Sea region?
Certainly. Well, the Sendai framework is an international agreement that was adopted internationally speaking. And I keep saying the word international because it's actually important to see and to discuss how the international level very much links with the local level, with everyday citizen. And the Sendai framework in these regards is really a classic example where we are looking at reducing vulnerability of society, of citizen, in order to ensure that we're building resilience of our communities. For the Baltic region, it actually means a great opportunity. It means an opportunity to build in resilience to disasters, but also an opportunity of breaking silos. And I think this is a fundamental dimension. Yesterday we discussed a lot in terms of security from a comprehensive point of view. And reducing the risk of disasters through the Sendai lenses, it really offers the opportunity to see how much our society is interlinked. A couple of practical examples and actually impact. We look at numbers. $306 billion lost in 2017 due to disasters. This is a global number. 80 million of people that were displaced due to disasters and 26 million people that were put back to poverty. This does not refer only to other regions. The Baltic region is actually very active. We heard about a lot of collaboration, a lot of wish to move forward in our society and develop our society. And yet we do have examples of disasters that really jeopardize what we have gained in terms of development. And here I can give you a practical example. Wildfire in Russia, forest fire in Sweden. Think about Poland. Last year in August, $1 billion USA dollars lost in 2 days of strong storm. And who borne the cost of this? If you're thinking particularly in Poland, what happened, it was actually the agriculture area where the insurance market was not so active. So actually it does have a real impact on our societal capacity to cope with these sort of issues. But there is also another very important element in terms of our interlinked society. And here is something that we have seen very clearly in 2011, taking the floods in Thailand. You think that that is going to be reflecting only the reality of one part of the world, but we actually saw the impact of that particular hazards in our society because the spare parts of our car and car industry that did not reach us. And then, of course, there is the cascade effect, which is another important element if we're looking at our societal resilience overall. Cascade effect, all of you are probably already thinking about Fukushima. Okay, earthquake that turns into a tsunami and a nuclear emergency. But cascade effect is also the reality of our society that are so interlinked. So when we have to look at the Sendai framework, we can look at our reality through these lenses. And if we do so, we realize that the silos that we very often operate in, the civil protection with people that are looking at climate issues, the scientific community, the Minister of Health, people that looks at economic aspect, these sort of silos can no longer exist if we are really trying to comprehensively look at the resilience of our society. So the Sendai framework is actually allowing us to undertake a number of actions through priorities that is going to be addressing exactly this comprehensive approach when we're looking at disasters. If I may then,
yes,
just one last point in order to elaborate also what it means in terms of the individual. And this is another very important reality. We often say that if we want to be resilient, we have to think globally, but really act locally. And this is a reality, again, if we look at our society. As an individual, as a citizen, as a person that lives in a city, we're going to be tackled with different type of hazards. Whether it's going to be your cybersecurity, looking at my bank account, whether it's going to be looking at floods that takes away my home, but also whether we're going to be looking at extreme events that happens also linked to terrorism. Somebody takes a gun or a car and is going to drive into me. So the necessity for the citizen to be informed about the risk that they are facing, but also to actively contribute to the prevention of this risk. And yesterday, actually, Bent mentioned risk assessment as a way, in a meaningful way, to learn about your risk. So being able to work in these circumstances with our society is going to be offering also a tool for our citizens to be positively and actively engaged in the development of our region.
So, I mean, if I listen to this, this is fascinating because, first of all, what we've talked about earlier with the levels, the local, the national, the regional, the global, right, all have to be connected to each other. So that's one set of distinctions in our heads that need to both be retained because those are contexts in which we work, and be broken down because we have to do the linkage. Then we have the question of geography, right? So the drought in China has an impact on food prices worldwide, which has a meaning for citizens in Egypt at the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011, and is part of the story that gets them into Tahrir Square, and is part of kicking off the Arab Spring and the new epoch in the Middle East, for worse or for better. So geography, we have to break that down, and yet at the same time geographical frameworks like countries we also work in. And then thirdly, you have the silos, which you mentioned. and this also, you were saying, Cecilia, the specializations, which are important, even though resilience is resilience, and there's the broad thing. So I was very struck by the fact that within that you mentioned information, because I think that possibly the key to understanding why resilience is resilience, why this is a fungible quality, is because so much of it is about receiving, understanding, and being able to act on information. And that seems to me to be where you got there.
Absolutely. If I may comment
please.
on this. Information is extremely relevant, and extremely relevant because by gathering information and sharing information, you get a common understanding of issues that create dialogues. And on this, I go back to the Baltic region, where I believe there is already a very strong collaboration, but actually information sharing in terms of disaster risk reduction and therefore different type of hazards is really going to help you creating a platform where exchanges can become also a tool for analysis, because numbers are talking a lot. And I can give you a practical example on how much numbers do talk. One of the issues that has been mentioned yesterday, but also by you this morning, talking about the traffic and all the infrastructure that is currently going on, is precisely the impact and the collaboration with the private sector. If we're looking at future investments, and I don't have the exact number for this Baltic region, but globally speaking, we're talking about 90 trillion USA dollars that are going to be invested between now and 2020 in terms of key infrastructure. Now, imagine the potential of being able to analyze this perspective of developments and ensuring that these key infrastructure are going to be risk-proof. What it means in terms of practical sustainability of your society. And this is exactly what the Sendai framework is looking at. Collaborate with the private sector, sort out what are your risks and what are your statistics in order to be able to really join hands with the private sector that is investing around 85% of investments overall in your countries. So this is a very important dimension. But information and data sharing becomes also extremely important when it comes to monitor. Because we know that it's very difficult to manage things that you cannot monitor. And the Sendai framework has got 7 targets and a number of indicators that are helping you to see what is the progression as you're moving forward in order to become resilient. And what is interesting to see about these indicators, that it actually requires for you, for the different, and Cecilia knows this very well, for the different part of the government and the different part of society to come together in order to collect this information, to be able to share them. And let me conclude by giving you another important relevance of information and information sharing. We've been talking yesterday about how our way of working, internationally speaking, and multilateralism somehow is being questioned. Well, in 2015, the international community came together in order to adopt a number of frameworks that are really shaping up our agenda for the future. The Sendai framework in March, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agenda, and the Urban Agenda, looking at the local level. All these international agreements are looking at our sustainability in the future, but they're equally looking at the issue of risk and prevention of disasters. Now, this coherence in the international agreements are allowing for us as a society to work more in a coherence as we are moving forward. So the indicators that have been developed for the Sendai framework are actually the same indicators that you are going to find in your Sustainable Development Goals as you're going to be reporting on issues related to climate, urban, and poverty. But also, they're going to be talking a lot about the Paris Agreement and the Adaptation Agenda, because you do have the same element of analysis. So information is key. Getting people and citizens engaged in understanding and gathering the information is going to be an investment for you as a society in the future.
So information, engagement, and action. We're going to have, I hope, again, a roving mic or two. And I'll come to that in a moment. So think what questions you may be wanting to ask. First of all, I want to give the other three panelists a chance to come back, because I think we've got to a really rich and interesting point in the conversation. Maybe actually I begin with you, Cecilia, rather than Björn-Ola, and come to you in a second. Just your reflections on what we're talking about the interaction between being informed and being active, between sharing information and perhaps also being able to trust information.
Actually, lots of reflections, actually. But the weakest part, I think, working with civil protection and preparedness at the time is actually how we are going to make public-private partnership work. Because we have lots of agreements. I have one with the Norwegian finance body, which is very important, but actually how to do it. It's a very important question, and I think it's important also on the Nordic and Baltic level. And then actually I come from health, so when you speak about trustworthy information, I think the discussion along evidence-based civil protection, looking into actually the effects of different actions we perform, is very important, because the research agenda is not as clear and it's more complicated and duplicated as well. So I know it's difficult. And my last remark would be that we have the saying now in the civil protection family, which we use as a metaphor, that civil defense is actually the first line of defense, and it goes straight into the resilience discussion. So that's the way we are working at the time.
So Björn-Ola, you've been thrown an issue about research, evidence-based policy, and the work which we're doing together in the MISTRA-funded project, or program, which you mentioned, is, for example, is very much about that, and trying to understand the new world and the new political world in the current climate and other environmental situations.
Yeah, and it's precisely, I think, that type of research that we now are looking for, the research that can connect the climate issue with other societal issues, because we see the linkages between health, security, transport, agriculture, and they are all connected. We see that very clearly in the Baltic region. So we need that type of interdisciplinary research team that can analyze the connections between the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also a very, it's a research topic that is evolving. But I had, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Three reflections.
Yes, that's what I was going to invite you to do.
Thank you. That I can just quickly go through. Because I think that information is important, but I think from our research, we have climate communication experts working in our team, is that we have a lot of information, and it's acknowledged, but it's not used. So it's rather that we need these, what you also were referring to, the dialogues, creating the platforms for interaction and for interacting in the research. We talk a lot about co-creating research where stakeholders from policy, from industry, and so are involved in research, for instance. And not the least, the citizens. After the climate negotiations in Bonn, which Fiji hosted in the fall, we have now the Talanoa dialogue, which are working so and so, but the idea is that we shall create this forum for dialogue, because that's what we need to share experience, because that's where you get the engagement and also the understanding of different positions. So information itself,
I mean, just to hover on that point for a second. I mean, research is one thing, right? But getting the research report and getting it on your shelf in a neat pile along with other research reports is not going to achieve a whole lot. It's very important from a research point of view that we learn how to find the right landing points for research, and also that we find a way to do research which engages the audience from the very beginning. And that, the co-creation process that you're talking about, that's part of what that's about. Yeah.
Well put.
Two other points you also...
Oh, yeah, okay. So, yes, and the other point is about the adaptations, which you also discussed. I think that's one of the things that we really need to look at in the Baltic region, is also the political economy aspects of adaptation, where we can increase vulnerability, the income disparities and so on. We see that around the world, But we can also see examples in the Netherlands, where you're from, but also here in Sweden, where we have adaptation projects that benefit the already rich and then relatively disadvantage the poorer ones. And we have to be, adaptation is great, and we need that, but we need to look at the unintended consequences on our adaptation projects. And the final point, I think, we might return to in the discussion here, is that we talk a lot about the Paris Agreement and rely on that. We know that the White House has announced that they want to withdraw from the agreement. And here's something that we need to perhaps discuss more in the Baltic region, since Russia still has not ratified the Paris Agreement, the Russian Federation. So we don't know where it will go. But we know that Putin has said that he had a very powerful speech in Paris, and he said that adaptation is an important topic, but still, we need.
And that is again where the climate issue links to the political world, and that's also part of the reason, part of the way in which it has an impact on societal security. Andrea, your reflections, again, kind of open goal for whatever you want to.
Yeah, thanks very much, and many reflections I would like to have, but just focus on a couple. Firstly, national climate risk assessments. I think that is something which most countries now have done. They increasingly link this to the disaster risk assessments, which are needed under the Sendai framework, but also linked to the civil protection mechanism, for example, in the EU. And what you see is exactly what was mentioned earlier. These can actually be used to create a shared understanding, not only amongst researchers and scientists and policy makers, but increasingly also involving citizens, although that's not really so easy, I have to say, as well, which actually came out of a workshop we had last week with all the EEA member countries looking at national climate risk assessment. So that's one topic to mention. Another topic is shared information. Yes, we are very much trying to help that process. Maybe to mention, we have a platform ourselves which is called Climate Adapt, where we try to, let's say, put together information from research projects, the most relevant outcomes, information from countries, information from cities, transnational regions. There's a whole section on the Baltic Sea region actually in there. But of course, it has to be used. So we did our own evaluation of Climate Adapt, and one of the key topics, of course, is to improve how can we enhance the uptake of that information. This is the crucial point, indeed, for the future. And maybe a last point to make is that there's also quite some further information available from climate services. There's a lot of money put in from the EU. This is still not much used, and there's a whole potential for this. There's a whole program, for example, Copernicus, that is now actually running. There is a service run by the ECMWF, and that type of information is actually out there. So in a way, the lack of climate data is not the problem for climate adaptation. I feel it's much more the changing of society and the behavioral changes, which is actually the real topic to address in the future.
I agree with that. I think that's right. There's a lot of data there. There are some areas of uncertainty that need to be pursued. There's certainly some explorations of what could be good practice, what can be effective, what the risks of maladaptation are, which you pointed to, Björn Ola. But basically, we know a lot. And the question is to think about how to respond to that. We have a little bit more time than we had yesterday evening. I'm less pressed for that, so we can entertain more questions. So please, the floor is open for you. But if nobody puts up your hand, these people want to carry on speaking. Yes, down here. Once we get the first question out of the way, that's usually the hurdle, then everybody can put up their hands for the second question. Yeah.
Yes, Jürgen Heimset. I was a bit surprised to hear that you don't see the platforms to bring out information. I see more the problem that we have too many platforms or too many organizations in the Baltic Sea region. We heard yesterday about trafficking by CBSS, and the Russian colleague also referred CBSS. Now we heard Mr. Høybråten about Nordic trafficking and Riga organization. So we actually have too many organizations in the north. Now you spoke of a lack of platforms to bring out the information. Can't you link up to CBSS? What's missing?
Okay, I must have expressed myself a bit not so elegantly. No, we have a lot of platforms for information, but we have been less successful in creating the dialogues and setting that up. But it's a lot of work going on to improve that, because we have had this communication model that we have a sender and a receiver. And that's, I think, one of the faults is us from the scientific community. If we just get the information to the people, they will understand how serious this is. But of course, it's not that simple. All politicians know that, right? So we have to work, I think, more and more, at least from a research point of view, it's more about creating the dialogues, to sharing perspectives, to get engagement, not least locally, because if you can attach what does climate change mean locally, what does mitigation mean locally, then you have something to relate to and you can respond. And then research shows that people can handle complex and abstract issues like climate change if you just contextualize it and create these forums. So that's what I meant. So we have plenty of information platforms. I agree completely with you.
So there was another question here.
Yes, hello. My name is Emma. I'm a member of the Swedish Parliament, and I've been on both sides. I used to be an expert, and then a researcher, and then people listened to me, and then I became a politician, and now it's opinion, even if I say the same things. So that's hard to get. But you're now talking much about adaptation, and we know that climate change is a fact, and it's here. But we also need to talk about how to make sure that we are below 2 degrees and fight climate change. And is that made in the same organizations, or do you see that as 2 different topics? Because sometimes it feels like that when you talk. Sorry.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Let's explore that. I mean, the Civil Protection Agency, as far as climate is concerned, is primarily about adaptation. The Sendai framework is primarily about response and adaptation. Your section of the environmental agency, European Environmental Agency, is probably primarily about adaptation.
But we do other work as well.
But the agency as a whole, obviously, is addressing the whole thing. So maybe it's easiest to start with the professor then, who's therefore the expert on everything. No, I mean, I'm teasing a friend. What the linkage is between mitigation and adaptation, because the questioner is right, that these are very often talked about at two ends. But are there interesting ways in which we can connect them more closely, or should we keep them separate? I mean, some things do belong in separate boxes, let's face it.
Yeah, well, if we look at the international negotiations, many countries want to keep them separate and have them as separate tracks. And it's even discussions about creating two clear tiers in the climate negotiations, just to make sure that we don't lose our eyesight on the adaptation issues. But otherwise, in principle, of course, they are intertwined. I think I agree completely. And a lot of our energy strategies and the energy projects that we now have will need also careful attention on adaptation measures and vice versa. We have to make sure that the adaptation measures that we have, we use a lot of concrete, for instance, and so on, which has a large carbon footprint, just to see the construction that we talked about here, which is partly for securing, for modernizing the transport, but it's also to make sure that we can handle the flooding, the storm floods in Lake Mälaren. So I agree completely. They are intertwined, but for political reasons, we might sometimes have to separate them.
So, Cecilia, we were talking earlier about resilience is resilience. And in one way, you could say that, well, a resilient society in a climate-changing world is going to be one which both adapts to the problems that may come, but also minimizes its own contribution to those problems. So that, philosophically at least, within the resilience framework, mitigation and adaptation would have to both sit there. Would you see that?
I think I agree with the professor, and that's very seldom actually. I usually is on my way, but I think it's like the theoretical discussion about safety and security. And you see now that they come closer and actually go into one. And I think we have the same issue here, even though it might be wise to keep on track on the different kind of work change here. And it will also be different agencies, cross-sectorial agencies, which has the responsibility. But we can see that these are more than interlinked. So I acknowledge the question, and we have, at least in Norway, tried now to make 4 hours we can discuss and work together with both adaptation and mitigation in the same room, so to say. So it gives meaning. Yeah.
And Andrew?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there are good reasons, there have been good reasons why adaptation got so much attention under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, because many of the least developed countries, which are probably hit hardest, wanted to have recognition that their issues were taken care of. So I think that is valid in itself. One of the key questions I see is to what type of future do we want or do we need to adapt? I mean, if we look at the current pledges under the Paris Agreement, you can clearly see we're actually heading for a 3-degree world. Yeah. Question, of course, is that going to change in the next years? Do we see a more ambition level of greenhouse gas emission reduction across the globe? But that's the current issue, and that's where I see one of the key links. Within the EU, there is, of course, a lot of discussion currently going on the 2030 target. Is it going to be 30% reduction? Is it going to be higher? There are many different views on that. This is going to be very soon clear in the political debate. Then there is the long-term strategy. The EU will develop this year a long-term strategy on greenhouse gas emission reductions in line with the Paris Agreement. That's also going to be a large debate when that comes out in the autumn. There will be afterwards well, not a long, but an in-depth debate about that. So I think that's also important. But I do actually see some benefits of having an adaptation focus, not separate, but at least having that attention to that topic. Otherwise, it would actually disappear. Otherwise, attention would probably, for 95%, actually go to mitigation issues.
So it's a fairly nuanced question, this, actually. It's neither completely separate boxes nor just one thing. So, Paula, yes, where do you stand on this?
I actually completely agree with the fact that the two are very much interlinked. And in fact, the whole discussions about adaptation and disaster risk reduction is actually looking at how best we can adapt to our climate reality. But there is a very important component when we discuss these sort of issues with the rest of our society, which is actually A, the use of our environment, but B, our technology and our scientific knowledge and understanding. And I think in the concept related to technology and especially innovation, that I believe is also an area where the Baltic region is very keen to work on. That's where really we can do some frog jumps, let's say. We can really advance in terms of mitigation, which I truly believe is what is needed in a discussion that is very tough in political terms, but at the same time very much needed. So I think the association of what are the classic overview in terms of risk with innovation and technology really can help us to see this line that has been created between mitigation and adaptation really fading away and become something more meaningful in terms of our society.
So, another question? Here. Mike's coming.
Yes, thank you. Really interesting discussion. My name is Johan Colling. I come from the Stockholm Resilience Center and also from the University of Gävle. I heard a question about adaptation. I think actually Andre mentioned nature-based solutions, for example. And I think that's a really good example of adaptation measures, especially in cities, to, for example, use ecosystem services in order to reduce heat waves and so forth. But could you comment on that, please, and expand a bit on that topic? Because I think it's really, really important, but sometimes it's sort of hidden and not expressed in a really insightful way. So please.
Thank you. And can I invite you, Andre, since the question comes first to you, but then the others can comment. We're live streaming this, so there's an audience of people who may be broadly interested but not experts. So explain nature-based solutions briefly first, and then pick up from the question.
Yeah, well, nature-based solutions are initially primarily focused on enhancing biodiversity and actually nature protection as such. So that's originally the main aim. But what is now seen is that it's also seen as some kind of a very interesting tool for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, which increasingly actually are seen as almost similar.
How would you do it? Give a practical example. Growing trees in the right place?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is, for example, about parks, enhancing green roofs in cities, as I mentioned earlier, enhancing the giving more room for rivers, which is as was mentioned, actually, I'm from the Netherlands, but although I live in Denmark, it's very much a solution in the Netherlands, dealing with potential flood risk from rivers, so giving rivers the room, and also renaturalization of rivers. So these are examples which can actually be applied in many areas across Europe, and also, of course, in this region. Maybe one thing to add here is that, or two things probably. There's a lot of focus actually on this topic of nature-based solutions from the European Commission, from DG Environment, but also DG Research. There's a lot of research projects now on this area. Also platforms, by the way. Maybe we have too many platforms, but actually there are quite a number of platforms now online which really show very interesting, nice solutions at the local level. Second point I'd like to make is that at city level there's so much happening at the moment, and that it's not about us in a way telling cities what to do. It's cities themselves, amongst themselves, learning from each other, working in networks, also again on nature-based solutions. A good example is the Covenant of Mayors, which is funded by the EU, but there are other networks like eClay, for example, and also making cities resilient from the Sendai framework perspective, which increasingly actually seem to merge. And I think that's important, talking about co-creation, and it's not researchers or politicians actually from the top telling them. The cities themselves can really enhance their capacity amongst themselves.
Oh.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. It is extremely interesting, but also it goes to the heart of our society, because cities is actually the place where you can zoom in and see what are the issues, the challenges, and what can be the solutions. There are a number of practical examples, and if I have to recall a city that actually has moved forward with some reflections in terms of eco-environmental considerations in moving forward, I actually mention New York. Very interesting experience from New York City. They had to reduce the sewage system, they had to enlarge it, and there they were faced by two perspectives. Going with the classic engineer system in order to be able to absorb more of these waters, or looking at a perspective of environment, of ecosystem, and see what it could be done. In fact, what it was proven out of the experience of New York is that if we were going for the classic engineering system, we were going to spend, or they were going to spend more money. It was actually 6 billion, the investment, compared to using green spaces, creating more green area that had three benefits results. It was less expensive per se. It was a huge reduction in the cost, over 50%. It created the opportunity of green spaces for the population in order to be able to meet and to exchange, but also it helped in terms of reducing the pollution of the air and the atmosphere. So this is where the ecosystem solutions come in together with innovation. And this is something that is extremely interesting if we're looking at the sustainability of our cities in these regards. We do have a campaign, which is called the Making City Resilience campaign, that it was mentioned also by André, and that the CBSS, I'm very happy, has embraced as an initiative. And the campaign is looking precisely at how practically the cities can develop, but also build in their resilience in order to know the risk and find the right solutions to ensure that they're going to be sustainable in their approach in moving forward with their society.
Thanks a lot. And there's another question just here. Yes, put your hand up, Michael, and here comes the mic. And then there will be one more there, and that might be the last one. We'll see how it goes. Michael.
Michael Salin. Höjbråten called the Baltic Sea a jewel, and Paula talked about us trying to prevent climate change from going beyond 2 degrees, but we are actually moving towards 3 degrees. There was mention of that. So building on that, and purely environmentally, for the professor, Björn Ola, if you extrapolate, are you seeing the deterioration of the Baltic Sea as an environmental structure being saved by the totality of the efforts to try to prevent degradation? Are you optimistic if you extrapolate?
Which way are the trends going?
No, I'm not optimistic. Not I'm optimistic that we see society transformation on its way. That will be not unprecedented because we had large society transformations before, but I think we are really towards the tipping point. But it's going slowly, and once sort of we get the green transformation on its way, we will be beyond 2 degrees path anyway. So I'm not optimistic for the Baltic Sea in that time perspective in the next 50 years. We will see increased eutrophication, I think, and that the salt content of the Baltic will also probably be less because of the increased runoff, and that will change the ecosystems. And we see very little progress, I think, when it comes to the Baltic. A lot of good strategies, but very little implementation, and that which is going to be further increased by the climate change, which I hope I'm wrong, but I can't see how we, with the current phase, will stay below 2 degrees. So I know it's politically impossible to say, but I'm not a politician, so I can say that.
And I mean, that is one of the things about resilience, is about taking the information, even if it's difficult, and starting from there, starting from what we see. There was a question over here.
Thank you. Jennifer Spence, Carleton University. I'm just curious, there's been the theme of collaboration and cooperation, which is common in a multilateral setting. But one of the things that struck me recently is a comment that politics itself is not a very conducive environment for solving problems like climate change. It's sort of fickle, it's short term. And a comment made recently that we really need to look to the private sector as one of the main drivers of where the culture change needs to happen. And yet there's been no discussion. This has been a very sort of public focus. So I'm curious in the panel's thoughts on the role of the private sector and what needs to happen.
Okay, so I think there's 2 parts of that, and we can each have a thought about it. One part is, politics is short term. It's the political world or the political mode is not a good mode for dealing with this kind of problem. How do we respond to that thought? And the other one is that in that case, do we think the private sector has more to offer? Should we be talking more about it? You raised it as a critical point, but let's take those thoughts. I'll start at that end and move along to this.
Can you repeat the first?
Is the political mode the right mode for dealing with issues of climate change? Climate change is long-term, transnational, trans-everything.
Yeah.
The political mode is short-term and,
Well, I think compared to business, I think politics is at least as long-term, perhaps sometimes more long-term. And the large infrastructure investments we need, it has to take political decisions, and we see a lot of the political decisions that are long-term as well. I think we sometimes tend to just focus on as politics is a mandate horizon, but it's not true. We see a lot of investments. But I think especially after Paris, it's very clear that the private sector, not only businesses, but also civil society and different types of NGOs, we are extremely important players together with the politicians to set the stage. Not only as implementers. We used to see the private sector as the implementers and of political decisions, but now the decisions are taken together. And in research we talk about a hybrid governance landscape. That we have a mix now, a slicing of the private sphere and the public sphere.
Cecilia?
Yes, I'm a bureaucrat, so I don't do politics, so I go straight on to what's now, it's mega trend in civil protection also, and now it's PPP everywhere, and that's private-public partnership. And I think to acknowledge that critical infrastructure is owned by in 80% not only commercial actors, but global actors, really underline the need for getting them into the business in civil protection and preparedness and prevention too. And I know when people banking and other people insurance are trying to make figures on how much they really should invest and how much they will gain if they invest in climate issues, they are really surprised. So I think this is the way to go. But the difficult part of it is that you get the gains later on, you know, 10, 15 years from now, actually. But it's the way to go. The other part which I'm very concerned about now is actually the population. And Paula said something about that. We are very involved in getting the population to take responsibility for themselves, also in climate adaptation and climate change, actually.
I mean, I was going to say, before I come to you, Andre, that one of the things, if you're thinking about the public sector, is that it is itself multi-layered. So that, for example, there's been some discussion about cities, right? And cities are very often able to act, as we've seen in the case of the US, for example, regardless of the national government framework. If you have a city, you know, the size of London, then it is a big actor. It's got a lot of economic clout. If things are done there, it has a big effect. So I think that remembering that, you know, the political world is not just the national political world, but it's everything down to the very, very local political world, the street and the village and so on. Andre, your thoughts on this public-private?
Yeah, to me it seems there is always a need for the strategic directions, the visions to come from the EU level, from maybe also the transnational level and the national level. The key issue, I think, is this collaboration and making sure that what comes from the national level is not prohibiting maybe what the local level would want to do, and it's giving the right incentives towards the local level. Towards the private sector, one thing maybe to keep in mind, many of the innovative solutions which the private sector is trying to pursue is actually coming from research which is funded publicly. And that's often forgotten. So we need to recognize that there is often research done before it's actually commercialized. Maybe one other point to make is that there have been calculations which clearly show there is a need for 180 billion euro per year. So annually is a massive amount, additionally for the energy transition. Now most of that money is not going to come from the public sector, so it has to come from the private sector. And that's exactly linked to this point I made earlier about the Commission coming up with this sustainable finance strategy. This is the big challenge, I think, for the future, how to make sure that the business sector picks it up. Of course, actually they see a lot of business opportunities as well. And I think they will actually do this, but it will not be by itself. They need incentives also.
Yes, I think the Sendai framework actually speaks a lot about the private-public partnership and the private sector engagement. And this was due to the fact that in preparation for the framework, we had a lot of consultations. And what came out of it is actually that the private sector was quite sore in terms of how much economic losses they had to cover and to suffer due to disasters. And they can see that if they don't take action, this is going to increase. But the true engagement doesn't come only by looking at themselves and the fact that their own activity is resilience. The true engagement comes from the moment in which there is an understanding that, in fact, if the place where they operate is not resilience, they are not going to have people coming into the production, because these people are going to be looking at their own survival, at their own houses that have been swept away. And therefore, getting the private sector engaged in order to build the resilience and ensure that in the future there will be no risk built in is something that is beginning to create a lot of echo and understanding. But what is interesting, and then you mentioned the local dimension and the cities, what we can see now that this private-public partnership that we've been promoting as UNISDR is also becoming meaningful at the local level, at the city level. And for instance, the small and medium enterprises are the ones that are bearing the cost of a lot of disasters that are taking place at the local level. 65% of them in Europe do not recover after a disaster. So it actually is very meaningful for them to become engaged and to begin to operate. And there is an interesting example, and I know that Cecilia alluded to it, places like Norway, but also Italy, the US, in Turkey, where you can see that the civil protection and the private sector are actually coming together, and they're really beginning to discuss what it means to be more resilient to disasters, not from the purely insurance point of view, but actually in terms of the prevention point of view from all different sectors of the private. And can I make a final comment on the very interesting question in terms of politician and politics? And the whole issue of resilience. I think we have to be positive, especially in times when we are challenged, and we could see the picture being very grey. We have to build on the elements that are giving us strength and capacity. I think a very good point was made already by the association on what is really the political sphere in these days, which is not purely formed by politicians any longer, but actually a number of other actors that are getting engaged. But the second point is that if we really create this knowledge and understanding among citizens and among constituency, and I go directly to a mayor that needs to be elected, it's going to become far more difficult for these politicians, even if they come in for 2 years, not let alone 4 years, to completely dismiss considerations and areas of engagement related to disaster prevention and resilience, because their own citizens are going to be familiar with what are the key challenges in our society. So there is a lot of added value in knowledge and sharing of understanding of risks.
Right, so we're coming to the final few minutes, and the reason why I keep on looking down at the floor is because I've got a big clock there which is ticking relentlessly at me. And this gives you each 1 minute, and we'll come along this way. To answer my final question, which is whether you think that the institutional framework that we have, and perhaps particular focus on the Baltic region, on the EU, and on the UN, whether it is fit for purpose in this climate-changing world.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
Danula. 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay.
So the words yes or no could occur. But
yes and no. Yeah, I think that the Baltic cooperation is great, especially when we look at adaptation. That is a platform where we can, where it will be useful, especially for driving the implementation. The UN, I think, has been very successful in coming as far as I think the UN can come at this stage. The EU is more difficult. I think. I mean, here we see that some countries in the EU can't have that active leader role they would like to have, because that we need to agree within the EU. If that is a good thing or bad thing, it's clearly EU has had a positive impact on climate. But now when it comes to show leadership and drive this process towards the transformation that is needed, I think it's quite a challenge for EU.
Yeah. Thank you. That was within a minute. Cecilia.
It's a broad question, but you asked if there is something I miss from the CBSS, and actually at the DG meeting a few weeks ago, we asked you if you could follow up to revitalize the Sleeping Nordic network on disaster risk reduction, because it's gone into some kind of stillness, and we really think that we could use that arena again. So hopefully we will manage that, and that will be at least one of the arenas we can go on discussing a lot of different themes, which has been brought up here at my level.
Andre.
I think the EU has been very important in the climate negotiations and climate development over the last 20 years, I would say. I think the EU has been fairly consistent in its approach. The difficulty I see is that, of course, we all know it's 28, 27 in future member countries which have to agree on a position which they then have to transfer to the global level. And that makes it very difficult for them in many cases, but I think they've done a fair job. I think a key challenge will be in the future what will happen with the new Commission, what's going to happen with the new EU budget. As I mentioned previously, there is a new EU budget out there, a proposal from the Commission for 25% of its budget going to climate action. Part of it, adaptation, probably mostly to mitigation. European Parliament currently wants to have more, for example. NGOs look for more efforts, so that's going to be a very interesting discussion with the new next 7 years ahead of us, I would say.
Paula, your minute.
Yes, the framework have been adopted. We spoke a lot about the Sendai framework. What I can see from this region, the Baltic region, is that you are extremely, and correctly so, very positive, careful and attentive in order to ensure that this dialogue among the region continues to be there and to be the case. So therefore, I also agree that it's best to have a lot of platform, the not platform where these exchanges can take place. Yesterday, Igor Neverov mentioned actually how disasters have no borders. And I think the engagement of the Baltic region in order to address in a regional manner disaster risk reduction and the Sendai framework, it would be very beneficial. But also it can create a good example to be shared in other regions and the international context. And for instance, in November, 21st, 23rd of November, in Italy, there's going to be the broad regional platform on disaster risk reduction, 56 countries coming together. I think the experience of the Baltic region and how you've been digesting and interiorizing these sort of elements of collaboration, it would be really valuable for other regions that are starting this process.
Well, I think that we've covered a huge amount of ground, both about the problem, about the potential solutions, the strengths and the weaknesses of the institutional framework and the prospects looking ahead. So again, I have a practical thing to say, but first of all, join with me in thanking the panel for really being fabulous. We got more time for the discussion and a better discussion because we allowed less time for the coffee. The coffee is available in two places, on the other side of the registration desk, and also for those of you who are going up to the third floor to the breakout room, Nick, to be discussing the healthy Baltic Sea issues, there's coffee right outside that room. So if you're going to that breakout session, the recommendation is head up the stairs, or indeed the elevator, and get your coffee up there. Thank you very much, everybody.